Guten Morgen, guten Tag und herzlich willkommen. My name is David Gill. I'm the German Consul General here in New York, and I would like to welcome you, dear guests, to what is already the fourth event of our series dealing with disinformation. Today, we will focus on how influential conspiracy narratives are. A very timely topic in an election year at a time marked by the rise of populist movements globally. When conspiracy narratives influences even political debates and controversies, accelerated by social media platforms. Yes, disinformation and conspiracy narratives have the potential to, and sometimes already do, shape public opinion and erode trust. Because of that, it is great to see that there's again such a huge interest in our series, and especially in this event. And it is a pleasure for me to briefly introduce our panelists today. Shannon Bond, welcome, is a journalist who specializes in covering the impact of conspiracy theories and on societies and democracy for NPR, the National Public Radio in the United States. Before joining NPR, Shannon dedicated 11 years to the Financial Times, where she served as a reporter and editor in both New York and San Francisco. During this time, she co-hosted the award-winning business and economics podcast, Alpha Chat. With a rich background in both technology and economics journalism, Shannon Bond brings a unique perspective to her reporting on conspiracy narratives and their impact on society and democracy. And I'm also pleased to introduce Pierre Lamberty, a distinguished psychologist and the managing director of the German NGO CMAS, the Center for Monitoring, Analysis and Strategy. Pierre stands at the forefront of the critical intersection between science and society, conducting research on conspiracy ideologies. She is the author of several books about conspiracy narratives, focusing on how they influence our thinking and what helps to counter them. As a co-founder of CMAS in 2021, Pia has dedicated herself to providing evidence-based information on a spectrum of pressing issues, including anti-Semitism and right-wing extremism. Thank you for being with us today, and thank you also to Steve Sokol, the president of our partner organization, not only for this series, the American Council on Germany, for once again moderating our discussion today. I'm looking forward to your conversation, and over to you, Steve.
Lieber David, herzlichen Dank. Many thanks. I can say on behalf of all of us at the ACG that we are delighted to continue the collaboration with you and your colleagues at the German Consulate in New York. Each of the events in our joint series dealing with disinformation has been fascinating, and I am certain that today will not be any different. So many thanks to you and your team for working with us. Let me also add how pleased I am to also welcome our two guests, Shannon Bond and Pia Lamberty. I can hardly think of two people who are any better than the two of you to talk about what's on our agenda today. As we get deeper and deeper into what promises to be an election year like no other, when nearly 4 billion people in 50 countries, or about 49% of the world's population, will be eligible to vote, there are growing concerns about the impact of misleading narratives and their ability to shape elections. And today, we'd really like to look a little bit more closely at the impact that such narratives have, but also at what can be done to try to correct those narratives. Shannon and Pia, you have both been working on these issues of misinformation, false narratives for quite a while. And I'd like to start by asking each of you to share with us why you think we've seen an uptick in conspiracy theories in recent years, and talk to us about why they seem to be becoming even more popular. I don't know who wants to go first, but let me just put that general question out there to get us started.
I mean, I can jump on first. I'm very curious to hear Pia's take on this, coming from sort of the scientific research perspective, because that's actually one of the things I wonder. Are we actually seeing more conspiracy theories, or is there sort of something else that's happening that's where they have so much more attention? Because of course there have been conspiracy theories, for all of human history. And I love to tell people in my work, I think we probably all believe something that's maybe not true, not grounded in fact, might be sound a little crazy. But I think most of those beliefs that people have don't necessarily drive them to action in ways that are destructive. I think what we've seen happening, why we're all so concerned about this, and we've seen really been amplified, sort of, from my view, by the way technology works, by the way particularly social media works, is really we've seen technology sort of enable people who hold very fringe, very radical beliefs to come together in a way that just wasn't possible until very recently in human history. And I think, it drives a lot of attention, of course. It drives media narratives. There's much more focus on this. But we're also seeing, people who hold these sort of beliefs have access to power in society these days in a way that is, shaping policy. It's, if your beliefs about voting, if you are, one of the folks who believes that, the voting system here in the US is rigged, that is going to affect what, not just how you vote, whether you vote. If you, if you believe, conspiratorial narratives about, how vaccines are a ploy to inject, tracking chips into the world population, you might not vaccinate your kids or get your own vaccines. And those, of course, have wider consequences. So I think that's really what we're grappling with is it seems to me, we've, really never before seen these sort of beliefs have so much impact on people's lives. And then, of course, still an impact on society.
So I think that's a great sort of segue to bring Pia in, right? And I think your point is a very important one, Shannon, that it's not that these false narratives are new. We've seen them for centuries, right? There has been misinformation, but we've never seen, as you said, these beliefs have such an impact on so many people so broadly. So Pia, what's your take in trying to understand this uptick in the belief of misinformation?
I have actually the same question, and I'm dealing with that a lot. Is there an increase or not? And it's not that simple, because, so for example, if you measure that people think there's a huge conspiracy about the death of Lady Diana, and nowadays less people believe that, does it mean the conspiracy beliefs decreased, or is it just less important, for example? That's one of the big issues when you want to research that. And there's one paper that tried to get a little bit more systematic overview that was published last year, 2 years ago. We have 2024. And that actually showed that on average, we don't have an increase on an attitude level. But what we see is an increase on a behavior level. That means there must be some sort of gap that the attitudes, the things that we have in our head, the cognitive perceptions, that they might be stable, but that they turned into action, into a refusal of vaccines, into attacking politicians or media and all this kind of stuff. So you have this parallelity of no increase on the one hand, but an increase on the other hand. And that makes it super complicated, but the issue of conspiracy beliefs is always complicated. So I think this is something we have to get used to. But this being said, what my impression is, and I need more data to be sure about that, that last year there was actually an increase. And we didn't have an increase 2020, 2021, but 2023, we saw an increase in QAnon beliefs. We saw also in Germany an increase in conspiracy beliefs about the Russian war of aggression towards Ukraine. So something I think might have happened last year, that probably these poly crises that we have to deal with actually did something to the people and their mindset. So again, that needs to be more research and further detail, but I could imagine that with every crisis on top, the societies get more and more fragile, and that this is actually something we have to deal with now.
So it's super interesting that you mentioned these polycrises that we're dealing with as societies around the world. We had a discussion this morning about artificial intelligence, and one of the things that came up was sort of the rapid changes in technology, and that we've been in periods in history in the past where there's been a change in technology, there's been disruptive technology, and people have been forced out of jobs and into new jobs, and there have been difficult transitions. But this is happening at a much faster rate than it's happened in the past, and it feels like there's much more going on. So Pia, your point about coming out of the pandemic in 2023, it seems as if we saw a bit of an increase, but I don't think either of you really mentioned the impact of social media. I mean, one of the questions that I have is, to what degree does this tool facilitate the spread of disinformation? And is that something that we should be looking at more closely as well?
The way I think about it is, I think you're absolutely right. Like the destabilization we're experiencing is really key, because of course, I think we're in these sort of periods of upheaval and rapid change. People are looking for answers, they're looking for explanations. And when things are changing really quickly, as we saw during the pandemic, sometimes there is not actually, it's really hard to find good information, right? And there's sort of, people talk about there being sort of this information void, an information gap. And that's exactly when you can have, it's very easy for misleading narratives, sometimes not in bad faith, just, incorrect information to spread. But then it's also an opportunity for bad actors to exploit that, right? Whether they're grifters or, people with, political ends, to exploit that, to sort of inject, to say, I can give you an answer. Here is an answer that is like, also at an emotional level, comforting, right? We want to make sense of the world around us. And I think where social media comes in here is that, I mean, first of all, it just makes it's, a massive distribution platform, right? Like we all have these broadcast channels, and it flattens information, right? I mean, if I'm on my feed, what I'm seeing coming out of NPR, the New York Times, Der Spiegel, The Guardian, or a U.S. government health agency, the World Health Organization, the European Commission, that information is being presented to me, sort of as equivalent to information from a completely random person down the street, or an influencer, or somebody who might even be in the pay of a foreign government. And I think it can be very hard, that flattening of information. It all seems sort of equally plausible or implausible. And I think that's the other thing. People tend to also tune out in a way. There's so much coming at them. Like, we can't absorb all this. We probably weren't meant to be able to be in this environment where we're consuming so much information. And so I think there's also a large degree of just sort of, nihilism, saying, who can know, no one can know, and therefore I can just, check out of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Pia, go ahead.
We did a study a couple of years ago where we wanted to see whether conspiracy believers have an expert bias, meaning that they more or less favor experts over lay people. And what we actually found surprised at that people who have or are low in conspiracy beliefs, they have an expert bias, meaning you talk more to the virologist when you want to know something about corona, makes sense. But the higher you are in conspiracy beliefs, the less you distinguish between experts and lay people. That mean on your timeline, it's the same level of evidence for you if your gardener writes something about a pandemic or a journalist who's well trained. And that makes it, of course, more difficult. And I think what's also important talking about social media is not just the spread of wrong information, wrong claims, by also, yeah, at least partially bad actors, but also people can group up much more easily. We saw that in Germany. We had the big protests against Corona, and then they were not able to mobilize anymore. And then they started something they called going for a walk. That happened in a time where you were legally not allowed to have bigger protests because of the pandemic. So they decided we just go for a walk, the conspiracy believers. And they did that all over Germany in an amount that actually the police was not able to cover that anymore, because it happened at the same day in all kind of villages everywhere. And they organized through the platform Telegram, and they had these networks there. And this is a difference. We saw that already 2014-15, when more refugees came to Germany. We had also right-wingers who organized protests. They used Facebook. These Facebook groups still exist till today, but in the pandemic, they were used to organize protests against Corona. So they just renamed the groups, had already the members, and from there, they brought the people to Telegram to have more radical content. So for organizing, mobilization, all these kind of stuff, social media is ideal, and can reach a much bigger crowd than it was able, or you were able before. So of course it plays a role. I'm not sure if it increases the beliefs, but I think it makes radicalization much more likely.
Can I just add something?
Yeah, please.
I mean, I also think one of the things to think about here is, sort of the sort of structure and incentives of social media platforms, right? I mean, they're advertising businesses. They want to get people to spend time on them. They incentivize, generally speaking, these algorithmic platforms incentivize content that is going to draw you in, right? And, is going to be emotionally resonating. But that doesn't differentiate between sort of emotionally resonating in a positive way or in a negative way. And so, it's reductive to sort of say that they optimize for engagement, but ultimately that is what they're doing. They're trying to keep you on there. And so I think that also, again, that sort of creates this cycle of, more and more, whether it's outrage or clickbait or whatever it is, but drawing people in with sort of things that are more extreme. Just the kind of thing that is going to keep people reading and keep them coming back. And I think we can't discount that as part of an element of this.
And that in a sense is kind of this marketing piece, if you will. I think one of the questions that one has to ask, and I don't know to what degree this comes up in some of the work that you're doing, Pia, or some of your observations, Shannon, is, are there some people who are sort of more susceptible to these narratives, or is it much more what you were talking about a little bit earlier of, in this time of so much uncertainty, people are looking for answers, and they're not necessarily finding the answers where they want them. And so this plethora of answers, which may or may not be valid or correct, gives people some sense of hope, in a sense, that they know what's going on around them. But are there some people who are more likely to pick up on these conspiracies than others?
It's actually, from a research perspective, interesting, because again, there's no easy answer when you deal with conspiracy beliefs. So usually you have these basic dimension of personality, and the first thing psychologists do is to see, is there a conspiracy personality? No, there isn't. There were tons of studies trying to prove it. Not really. So also gender, not really clear if this is an issue, and age also really differs based on the narratives you're researching. And what the psychological research came up on an earlier stage was saying there are actually like 3 basic motives that conspiracy beliefs can fulfill. First is that we already mentioned, in a world full of chaos, people look for some sort of structure. And you can really see that if you confront people with a lack of control, they start seeing patterns where there are none. So there's some kind of pattern searching. Then the other is create some sort of meaning and understanding of the world. The advantage of conspiracy theories for these people is that you don't have to deal with the complexity of the world. You have a personalized evil that's responsible for everything. So you don't have to deal with injustice or structural problems in the world. You say this person is responsible and I just have to get rid of this person to solve all my problems. And the third thing is that conspiracy beliefs can fulfill a need for uniqueness. So also the social dimension. And I think that this is important to keep that in mind, that we cannot tackle it just with media literacy or better understanding of the world. It really gives something to the people. They feel they're special, and the other people are all in German, we call them sleeping sheeps, the sheeps that the herd that just follows, that has no own opinion, and so on and so on. And these three factors are actually relevant. What we see in research is that education level plays a role, but not so much because of differences in intelligence, but more because people with a lower education level feel excluded from public discourses. And so they also feel some sort of political lack of control, and therefore are more likely to believe in conspiracy theories. On top, you have also country level factors. So a country that's more democratic has less conspiracy beliefs, authoritarian countries are more likely, and so on.
So I was going to ask to what degree level of education might play a role in this. So I'm glad that you brought that up. Shannon, in some of your reporting, what have you seen in terms of whether some groups are a little bit more susceptible to these movements, to this information or misinformation than others?
I mean, I think I've largely sort of encountered the same thing Pia described. I mean, it's hard to make sort of generalizations about this. One of the things I'm really interested in is this, one thing Pia mentioned a little bit earlier, this idea of how we've seen, especially sort of during the pandemic, sort of people come together around sort of one set of conspiracies, and then how that has morphed, right? And I think, QAnon is a great example of this, where we've seen it sort of absorb in other seemingly unrelated conspiracies, or you've seen, here in the US, there's, we had the rise of groups that were opposed to mask mandates, opposed to school closings. And I should say, in those cases, some of that was very much not breaking down on a particularly political spectrum. You had, you had very frustrated, for example, parents, right, all over the country, who were concerned about schooling and kids. But then you saw, and sort of that was something that kind of brought people in, people looking for answers or looking for a way to express their frustration, what was happening, bringing them into, then, like I said, a march or a rally or an event, with, folks in some case who were like pretty hardcore anti-vaxxers, or folks who were pretty hardcore libertarians. And certainly not everybody is going to get then automatically radicalized that way, but some subset of those people do. What I don't know enough about, and I'm about the social sciences, right? How, is there a way of, in that group of people, who are the ones who might then go on to remain in those more conspiratorial communities, and then sort of just adopt other conspiratorial beliefs. But we've definitely seen this sort of merging in a way of different strands of beliefs. And I think it makes it actually even more complicated to try to answer the question of like, who is susceptible and why. I think, some of it may be about where you are in life, what's happening in your personal life at this moment.
I'd like to maybe fold in a couple of viewer questions right here. One of our viewers, who describes themselves as left of center, writes the following: I listen to NPR every day, and almost every day I watch the German news Tagesschau, Tagesthemen. Almost all of the examples of disinformation and fake news come from the conservative and/or right-wing spectrum. This is also exemplified in our conversation today. Is there not also misinformation coming from the left and the progressive spectrum that deserves the same amount of attention?
Now I can talk about the decisions we make about coverage. I would certainly never say that disinformation is like politicized one way or the other. As I said earlier, I think people hold all kinds of beliefs. There's lots of things that people believe that aren't true. We could spend, me and my colleagues could spend all of our time writing about stuff on the internet that's not true. What we really try to focus on is impact. What is the impact it's having? And I think when you look at what's happening through my reporting, when I'm talking to researchers studying this, a pretty clear picture emerges that the kinds of certainly things around, say, claims of electoral fraud, I think, the COVID stuff's a little more complicated because I think that actually has brought in a wider political spectrum of people than people maybe really understand. But when we see a lot of these beliefs, and I think in the US, when you look at what has happened to the Republican Party and how much these beliefs have really been taken up by the highest levels of the Republican Party, we probably you do see more coverage, around these, these as conservative beliefs or the impacts in these conservative and Republican spaces. And I think it would be false equivalence to say, yes, but also liberals believe this. Now, certainly, if we see those kind of impacts, we report on them as well. I think one area where this absolutely holds up is in terms of wellness communities and sort of health misinformation, which absolutely is something that thrives in progressive communities. I mean, I live in the Bay Area, I'm a mom. I'm in plenty of pretty crunchy mom groups. And let me tell you, there is a lot of stuff out there and there has been excellent reporting from that as well. So, but I think it's one of the, we are trying to go to where the story is, and really talk about I'm sure we'll get into this. There's a question about amplification, right? And when we decide to talk about these things, and how we talk about them responsibly and what we want to elevate. And I think for us, part of the bar for us is what kind of impact is this having on the world?
Yeah, Pia, same sort of question to you in terms of the German landscape, right? We talk mostly about the AfD, particularly after the Korrektiv reports on the secret meeting that the AfD had, and certain trends in Germany. But what about on the political left?
Yeah, so if you look through a research lens, what you see is that conspiracy beliefs are more likely to be on the right part of the political spectrum, but you have that at both sides. So it's not exclusively there. I think it really depends on the topic and how it's instrumentalized. So the wellness topic we had already, New Age beliefs, there you have often people that are a little bit to the left or a little bit more. But also when we talk about anti-Semitism and disinformation and propaganda, there's often aiming right now also towards the left. So I wouldn't say it's only on one part of the political spectrum, but it really depends on the topic. So Al Jazeera is aiming for the political left, while Russia Today is more aiming maybe more simple view, more on the political right. So it really depends on the topic. Wouldn't ignore the left or the center.
Yeah. I mean, I think both of you have talked about the fact that this covers the spectrum, but that there are specific reasons why certain narratives are picked up and focus on a certain direction. Another viewer is curious about sort of conspiracy narratives that originate as conspiracies, but then turn out really not to be a conspiracy. So this person is curious about something like the origins of COVID in China, where there were certainly lots of stories circulating about where COVID had come from. There was a lot of denial on the part of the Chinese government that it had not come from Wuhan. But then, of course, it turns out that it's not a conspiracy after all, because that's how one traces it back. How do you handle these kinds of news stories, but also narratives, right, that evolve a little bit? Pia, you're nodding, so why don't you go first?
That makes it difficult. I mean, as a researcher, you need to define what a conspiracy belief is. And in psychology, we decided to not include whether it's right or wrong, because this is not our job. I mean, I don't have this. Who do I quote? Who is the objective truth that tells me what's right or wrong? So we do the easier step out by not including whether it's true or not, but we can do that for our research. That's a different approach. And I would say, if you say, I don't know, Corona is is not from China or whatever, is not a conspiracy belief yet. You have to have this secret evil force in it that needs to be, or is a crucial part of the definition. And that's actually very important when you work in that field, that you really follow these definitions and not mark just something that might be true or false as a conspiracy belief. Then it could be a misinformation or disinformation. But in a conspiracy, when we talk about conspiracy beliefs, it's really the US government was hiding that they brought the coronavirus to China to gain world power or something like that. That would be the conspiracy belief. And as far as I know, that wasn't proven right yet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, kind of picking up on that idea, one of the things that my team talks about a lot, we try to be pretty precise in the language we're using around when we're discussing this. And actually, this is sort of a separate issue, but the term disinformation itself has become fairly politicized, in the way that sort of fake news has become, where it can often be used, sort of wielded as a weapon, like, something that I disagree with is disinformation. And so what we do actually try to do is be able to, is this a misleading narrative? Is this something that's being presented out of context? Is this a conspiracy theory, right? And those things are, can operate quite differently. And I think, one of the things, this viewer is asking about, sort of another narrative around China, right, that was controversial. It has been the question of, was this an animal origin virus or a lab leak, right? And I think that is a great example of where, like I said before, lack of information, kind of those information gaps, lots of speculation can come in. And then, we can sort of also in our as journalists, I think in our want to be cautious about things, we want to say, well, we don't know, we can't say for sure. And I think there was some early, sort of dismissal of the idea that it could be a lab leak, which was then sort of doubled down on by the social media platforms, who eventually who at one point Facebook said, you can't discuss this on Facebook. And then Facebook stepped that back because I think they realized actually, it wasn't known. They weren't able to say one way or another if this is true or not. And so they shouldn't be telling people they couldn't discuss it. Mm-hmm. But, I think it's just, I think it's the kind of topic, how do you set policies around that? Whether you're a newspaper reporting on this, how do you describe that? When it's a topic where at this point, we just don't know. And I also think we need to appreciate, say in science, our knowledge changes over time. And so something that seemed maybe very certain, in the past will seem less certain now. And something that seemed kind of crazy, actually, maybe there is some evidence for it. But we're not very good, I think, at dealing with that and being transparent. I think we could be more transparent, certainly in the media with our audience about, what do we know and what do we not know? And how do we talk about what we don't know? But it's very complicated in covering these topics for certain.
Yeah, I think you've both kind of helped sort of unpack some of the complexity that's involved with all of this, right? Pia, your comment about there being no objective truth to kind of turn to and get the answers, and Shannon, your point about knowledge changing over time as we find out more. And I think that ties in with just this desire for people to have some sense of certainty and some deeper understanding. I'd like to maybe shift gears a little bit and come to some of the work that you do at the center, Pia, and then talk about how that's picked up in the media. Because one of the things that your center is called the Center for Monitoring, Analysis, and Strategy. So you have been monitoring the spread of conspiracy narratives. And I'm curious to hear how you go about monitoring these different narratives and who you share your results with. And then I'd like to talk to you, Shannon, about sort of the response to some of your reporting as well. So Pia, can you talk to us a little bit about the monitoring process?
Of course. We have different approaches and projects, but I think the work we have been known for the most is our monitoring of Telegram, the platform. Who doesn't know it? It's a little bit like a combination of WhatsApp and Facebook, maybe. So it is a messenger app, but that has a lot of social media functions. already before the pandemic, right-wing extremists in Germany started using it more and more as a platform because there's basically no regulation happening. Telegram is not available more or less for governments, or it's really hard to reach. They don't follow all the legal rules that other platforms should follow and also not always do. Yeah, therefore it was used a lot. Also, Islamists used it for a long time for spreading propaganda and so on. And in the pandemic, it became super popular among this spectrum. And we are doing a so-called real life long-term monitoring. That means I can see what's happening on channels. I can see how they increase, if they buy follower, which also happens. If they don't get the size they want to, then they can also buy on Telegram followers. Which messages have the most reach, who shares what, so you can understand actually what's the network behind, who builds maybe the channels, because they also didn't just grow naturally. You had people who actually set them up to build a bigger network and so on. This is the one work we are doing. We also were, I think, one of the first in Germany who analyzed trading of fake vaccine passports in Germany, and how Telegram is used for that. Then we have projects that deal with right-wing terrorism. There's more about OSINT research. That means you use what's there on public information to understand terrorist propaganda, the spread of manifests, and where they are actually radicalizing. And we do research and surveys and polls. So, for example, on the spread on pro-Russian propaganda, we published that last week, for example, that we did a survey where we showed that almost 20% of Germans believe that Putin is fighting a global elite that is pulling the strings in secret and stuff like that. And we used this knowledge to counsel society, politicians, ministries, and so on through reports and policy briefs, research paper. I work together with universities. So that is a short overview of what we do.
And so what's the response then to some of these findings? You know, what do you hear back from people?
I work about conspiracy beliefs for, I think, almost a decade now. And pre-pandemic, it was really, really hard to get people's attention. Also in academia, by the way. I remember us writing letters to the editors saying, this is a really important topic. It's not just a fringe topic. It is important for social psychology too. And then Corona happened and it completely changed, and people were very interested and also very desperate, because I guess almost everybody has somebody in their surroundings that believes in some sort of conspiracy theories. And also with the start of the Russia's war against Ukraine, the invasion, we also saw a change in interest also about talking disinformation. Disinformation also has always these spikes in interest, like when there's an election, people look, or since 2022, it became more or increasingly an issue. And especially now also with the rise of right-wing extremism in Germany, we also see that there's actually people are actually desperate how to deal with all of these challenges that we have to deal with right now in a world that's more and more unstable.
So, you know, switching sectors, I'd like to come back to Shannon. I mean, you know, you both, right, in your work are kind of poking at very complex issues that are hard to understand, but you're also, I would imagine, sort of upsetting some people who say, wait a minute, you don't understand our perspective or our viewpoint. I'd be curious to hear from you, Shannon, what some of the responses have been to some of your reporting where you've been trying to increase awareness about what's going on when it comes to misinformation and false narratives, and what you've been hearing. At least one of our viewers and a couple of others mentioned it too in the chat, sort of wish that there was a way to have more impartial and balanced news that they could consume. They find that everywhere that they look, there's one bias or the other. for me, it comes back to reading multiple sources and then making your own mind up. But what are you hearing as you're out and about, Shannon?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly, we hear from folks who why, and I think this is actually just true of this beat. This is true of being a journalist. Why didn't you cover this? Why did you cover this other
Right.
thing? I think, what we certainly have found, one of the things have focused on is like writing about folks who are profiting off of conspiracy theories or misinformation, and they often don't like being exposed for that. I have a colleague who did some great reporting during COVID around some of the sort of folks in the anti-vax movement in the US who'd become very prominent online, and sort of talking about how, they also, just happen to also be selling a whole lot of supplements and we're discouraging people from taking vaccines, but, we're pushing the drugs or supplements that they were selling themselves. And we've also done some reporting, on so the doctors who were rejecting vaccines but promoting ivermectin, and I think so I think for us, one of the things we're very interested in is thinking about these sort of as like a sort of a system in a marketplace, and of course you get pushback from that because the folks involved in that don't want you reporting on it. I think when we more generally, I broadly don't think a lot of people who are very deep into some of these more extreme beliefs are listening to NPR or are frankly consuming much mainstream media anyway. I think a hallmark of a lot of this is you can't believe what the media has told you. And so, for me, it's less about necessarily reaching those people and convincing them they're wrong, because I also don't think that's how beliefs work. Like, I don't like, pat myself on the back, like I can convince somebody that they're just incorrect. But I think a lot about, as we were talking at the beginning, I think we're all encountering these beliefs more in life. I mean, people have family members who, for whatever reason, maybe during COVID or the election or whatever, have gotten radicalized. And they're really interested to understand more about this, to think about how they can talk to their family members. And so we think about that as an audience. And, I think those are good stories to do too, because you're kind of giving people tools to understand how to, where this might be coming from. Why are you hearing this thing? How does this fit? Some of the stuff, it's like, this may seem like some crazy loony thing, but actually here's how it fits into a much longer running and, really troubling pattern, of anti-Semitic tropes. I mean, so many of these conspiracy theories just come back to anti-Semitism, right? And I think it's important to help people understand that and to better equip them to evaluate information they're seeing elsewhere.
I mean, I guess, one of the follow-up questions I would have to both of you is, it seems to me as a layperson that many of these conspiracy theories have a kernel of truth at their core somewhere, right? That makes it a little bit harder to refute sometimes. And one of our viewers is curious whether there are some examples of conspiracy theories that actually turned out to be true in the end, or that were refuted and then ended up not being substantiated. I'm wondering if you have any sort of examples that you can share along those lines. But it seems to me, and this is part of the complexity, that it's very hard to completely dissuade some of these theories because there are some of these elements of truth in them.
I would say that, generally speaking, conspiracy theories are usually more successful when they have this core of truth. So when I say, for example, about the Great Reset, I mean, the book exists, but it's not what conspiracy believers make out of it. And usually that works well. And of course, there are, I don't know, secret plots, conspiracies, whatever. And a lot of journalists uncover them or work on exactly that. That's part, I think, also of a free press. But usually they are not uncovered on Telegram channels from people that, I don't know, spend their time in fringe groups and upload PDFs that they found somewhere in the internet. It's part of good, important journalistic work to do so.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, it's and then this is broader than just conspiracy. I mean, certainly with talking about misinformation. I mean, there's almost always sort of a core of something true there. You know, it can make it complicated to debunk, because often what you're saying is not this thing isn't true. You're saying this is it's being presented out of context, or right. You're saying that something exists here, but it actually, if you read the source that they're referring to, it's not in there.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, and I think we often see, and I think we see this a lot with sort of how QAnon beliefs have evolved over time. The sort of quote unquote debunkings themselves become part of the conspiracy theory, right? It's sort of any challenge to the idea sort of gets absorbed into it. And so again, I think there's sort of limitations to you know to that as an effective strategy. No, I mean, you know, that I don't know, I think you know, things like the you know, the Tuskegee experiments. You know, there's been lots of examples where reporting has eventually uncovered something that, you know, you know, can be reduced to a powerful group of people was trying to keep something harmful hidden. That absolutely happens. You know, we shouldn't discount that. But I think Pia is exactly right. Like, uncovering those sort of things kind of takes time and resources that is sort of unlikely to be what's going into some of these, you know, a social media group. But that itself gets turned into do your own research, right?
Yeah. And that's, you know, I think the do your own research is sort of one of those to-dos for all of us, and maybe one of the things that can help us not fall into the trap of disinformation. And before we close today, I definitely like to come back to what one can do to be better informed. But before we do that, I want to fold in, you know, one more question that has to do with the current sort of political landscape. I mean, obviously, Shannon, you've brought this up today, and in some of your coverage on NPR, you've been looking at some of the elections that are taking place this year. And Pia, you've been pretty outspoken on the alternative for Germany, the AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, and the sort of role that they play, the amount of oxygen that they take on the media landscape. But one of our viewers raises, I think, a very important question, which is they'd be very curious to know each of your thoughts on sort of the cross-pollination between right-wing populist groups internationally and how they share conspiracy theories. And I think this is particularly important as we look to the European elections this summer, where it's not just the national elections that are going to be taking place, but much more broadly. How much sort of collaboration is there between QAnon theories and those spreading to the AfD and other far-right movements in Europe?
I mean, the cross-national spread, you know, something we are certainly very much look at. I mean, I reported on the attack on the, you know, in Brazil, you know, it's sort of there January 8th in Brazil, where there was, you know, an attack on their capital that, you know, had explicit parallels to what happened on January 6th in the US. And, you know, during that election campaign, you know, Bolsonaro was sort of using claims, you know, that Donald Trump had made about the US election being rigged to claim the Brazilian election was being rigged. We had figures like Steve Bannon, you know, folks on far-right media in the US, you know, saying the Brazilian election was going to be rigged, even spreading the same lies about Smartmatic and Dominion, the voting machine makers. You know, their voting machines weren't being used in Brazil, like, but you see that a lot. You see these things, you know, often in that case, that's probably one of the most explicit, like it was literally like directly being communicated. You know, so I think in some cases it's very direct. I mean, Steve Bannon has a project of doing this around the world, of going to countries around the world and trying to, you know, bring these ideas. But then I think a lot of it happens, you know, because of some of the dynamics we've talked around about social media, and I'm sure Pia can talk about this in terms of, you know, how things work with the, you know, what she's seen on Telegram, where, you know, sort of there's just also kind of passive osmosis of these, you know, these threads and ideas and framings, because people see that they work somewhere else or they seem to resonate, and it can be very easy to sell one narrative, you know, to take this as an example. This happened in a different country, I think, and so therefore it must be likely to happen here. And I think there's, you know, there is that's very prominent.
Yeah. We saw that also in Germany, for example, with QAnon, that it got popular in the States, and then you saw a transfer to Germany. And the German conspiracy believer movement was called Querdenken, which means something like lateral thinker.
Yeah.
And they had a Q as a symbol. And that make it perfect for them to use QAnon, which also has the Q as a symbol, because it like meant for them the same. And you saw it really in Germany all over, that they wrote it on street signs, on the ground, and so on, and used that a lot. And you had special groups who translated all the stuff from the US to German, that the German scene can also use that for their own parts. We actually did also a report on that, where we showed all that. It's also in English available in Germany. German, so it plays a crucial role, sometimes in a weird way, as Shannon said, that they also try to explain that something about Germany using this voting machines, which is not true. They don't. But what they try is to increase the distrust in election itself. So even if it sounds maybe absurd to our ears, for other people, it is another puzzle piece in increased distrust in democracy at its core. And I would say it's not only right-wing extremists, also authoritarian states that play a role. When you listen to Putin's speeches, he often uses like terms that are very welcomed in the conspiracy believer milieu, like about sovereign citizens, for example, or that he claims like, Germany is not sovereign and stuff like that. And then you see how it's spreading on Telegram and becoming big. So there is a international communication narratives are used, the same topics. And I think that especially attacking elections, what you see a lot in the US, was not so successful in Germany so far, but I'm very afraid that this gets bigger and bigger, and especially latter votes, that they become more in the focus of attention. The AfD is also trying to do that.
So we only have a few more minutes left, and I'd like to maybe sort of talk a little bit about kind of the path forward and try to end on a little bit more of an optimistic note. You've both talked a little bit about the need for media literacy, and I think that we need to look at that a little bit more closely. One of our viewers is curious when children or students should learn about the dangers of conspiracy narratives, and goes on to even ask whether media ethics should be mandatory in our education system. And I'd be really curious, particularly as parents, what are your thoughts on when does one need to start letting young people know about this danger, particularly given the social media component that we were talking about before?
I would say we shouldn't focus only on the young people. Also people that are a little older, you see that actually in studies, they usually don't know so much where they actually can find the right information. They're often overwhelmed by the internet. And also WhatsApp is often used, for example, for spreading misinformation. So I wouldn't stop with children. So I would include the whole society.
I agree.
Generally speaking, it sounds great to have a subject in school that deals with media literacy, media ethics, and so on. But what's a little bit my issue here is that whenever we have a societal problem, we hope to solve it through school. And this is a lot of pressure on schools that they have. And when you talk to teachers, they often complain that exactly this is happening. So I'm not sure if there's actually the capacity in schools to add a subject like that, even though it's important, with AI coming further and further even more. But I think what's helpful is also talking about other approaches that are not so much focusing on media literacy, but for example, social norms. So what is, so for example, during COVID, we had a lot of these right-wing shaped protests in Germany, but nobody protesting against it, because those who would protest against it, they stayed at home to not get infected. This created an atmosphere in a lot of cities where it looked like conspiracy believers are actually the mainstream here. And this can also increase radicalization, or the feeling that you could follow your belief system. So this is an approach that's often neglected, and I think is really, really important. And as much as I think media literacy is important, regulation of social media, I think, is key. These companies have a huge responsibility. The information space is so polluted with wrong claims. And I don't have the feeling that we have the right answer yet. And things are developing further and further, and people don't even have the digital degree for primary school, but actually we would all need a master's degree. So things, yeah, the way things are changing. So yeah, more pressure on social media. I guess we should follow on that.
And I mean, I do think that that sort of regulatory framework is hard to achieve, given how quickly things are changing and evolving. Shannon, you're more than welcome to sort of take a shot at the same question, but I'd also like to maybe draw on your experience in the media. There is so much fact checking that goes on in the media when you think about the statements that are coming from candidates in election campaigns, but just in general. There is also a lot of sort of information campaigns that are going on to try to address the influence of conspiracies. I'd be curious to know from you how effective you think some of these fact-checking efforts are to get people to understand what's correct and what's false.
I mean, I think it is good that there are fact-checking efforts. I think, I think the cases where when you have, social media platforms are able to, put a label on I think we've seen definitely this question around content moderation itself has also gotten very politicized. And I generally think it's not super productive for the platforms to take down a ton of content. Obviously, that we're not talking about things that are like illegal or, terroristic images or sex abuse, but I think especially when it's sort of around narratives and stuff, it can get very sticky. And so I think it can be helpful to append those labels. How many people are actually clicking them and reading them? I don't know. But I don't know. I have a very old-fashioned idea around journalism. It's like we are here to to kind of bear witness and explain to people what's happening, and I think it's absolutely valuable and valid to do that. But I also think that it's really important to go beyond just the straightforward fact checking, and get in, to get into that reporting around what are the incentives here? What are the systems? Who is profiting from this? How is it adjacent to power? How is it benefiting people in power? How is it, how are these things eroding trust in elections, in democracies? I think that has to be a crucial part of the puzzle too, because otherwise, I think it's a kind of a flood of information that people can just sort of cast aside. And then just the only thing I would add, I think Pia really covered it when it comes to thinking about approaching this both in terms of education and regulation. One of the things I think about a lot. I have a second grader. I report on this world. I think a ton about how and when to think about talking to my kid, not even just specifically about conspiracy theories, but about using the internet, about information on the internet. Now I'm thinking a lot about AI and how I'm going to talk to him about what it will mean for all of us to be interacting with like generative AI products, in everything in our media, and what that means about like how what we can believe and what we can't believe. But it's really hard, because what you don't want to end up doing too is making people feel like they can't believe anything they see or read.
Right.
And I don't have the answer on how you strike that balance. I worry about that all the time in the reporting that we do. I'm like, what if what I'm doing actually is just making people feel like they can't believe anything they see? Like, that's not what I want to do. But
I think there's a difference, right? It's part of it is calling into question what they're being exposed to and getting them to think about it, right?
Yes.
That's the essence of it. It's not, exactly. I can't believe what I'm hearing, but maybe I stop and take the time to look at some other sources and think about it in a broader context. And I think that's why the work that each of you are doing is so important, right? You're coming at this from different directions, from more of an academic, wissenschaftliche perspective, scientific perspective, versus the media perspective. But at the end of the day, it's really all about creating greater awareness about the challenges and dangers that are there, and trying to get people to think more critically and carefully about the information that they consume. So maybe sort of lastly, to fold in some thoughts that have come up from a couple of viewers, there are questions about whether sort of what the best framework is to combat online disinformation, whether that's at the national level or whether there's maybe a multilateral level that can have an impact, and whether there are some institutions that are doing a better job than others at working against the influence of conspiracy narratives. I'd be really curious to know from each of you if you have any sort of examples of people who are out there who are doing a good job that we should think about paying a little bit more attention to.
I think the folks in the county elections office in Maricopa County, Arizona, are excellent at this. They are like out there in Twitter, in like Twitter replies, like literally responding to people. They've been very proactive. And that's very much on the local level, but I think it tells you that can be effective because it's on the local level. You know, we know that people do actually tend to have trust in their local elections, and have credibility in like local officials that they might not have for people on the national stage. So I think that can be a model, but that's a very, like, again, that's like in one place in a very specific way with, you know, a familiar figure. I think it's much harder when we're talking about like national level governments or institutions, not least because of the First Amendment. But I also think people don't have that kind of trust. But that would be an example I'd highlight. I think they do a great job.
And I think what's important about that is, as you say, it's at the local level, which means it's also something that could be done by other communities as well, right? This is something that could be modeled elsewhere as well.
Yeah, and generally speaking, I would say the local level is key. Also, when we talk about local journalism, I think that needs to be really underlined how important that is. So also when we talk about conspiracy beliefs, we know that when there's no local news coverage, there's more likely to be corruption. We know when there's corruption, people believe more in conspiracy theories. So really, really important. We shouldn't forget the local level just because the world is so international. Generally speaking, I would say I would distinguish between dealing with disinformation in the sense of somebody from the outside comes and tries to stir the pot, or conspiracy beliefs, which is a little bit more broader. But there are also nice online games that you can play. For example, Get Bad News is one, and the other is Go Viral. And they also did scientific research. If they work or not, you can play them 5 minutes, and they don't solve all of our problems. But I think it's a cute approach. They exist in a lot of languages, and I like that they are built like that. And generally speaking, I would say it's really important to deal on all levels with maybe quality of information and ideologies, because they play on all levels a role. It doesn't matter if we talk, I don't know, also, in the context of wars and crises, this is an issue we have to address, but also on the local level. And we saw that, for example, in Germany, or generally speaking, also that some countries, for example, China, also addresses the local level, and that we have on local German TV Chinese propaganda shows. So yeah, it's multi-level and complex, but maybe this is also what makes the topic interesting.
It's certainly complex. It certainly means that the two of you will have a lot to do in the weeks, months, and years ahead. I mean, I don't see this issue going away anytime soon, but I do think that the work that you're doing, the kinds of programs that exist, the kinds of conversations like this one are so important, just in terms of increasing people's awareness. So a herzlichen Dank, a huge thanks to both of you for taking the time to have this conversation with us. Also on behalf of the German Consulate General in New York and the American Council on Germany, it was a real delight to have both of you with us for this incredibly thoughtful and thought-provoking exchange. So many, many thanks.
Thank you, Steve. It was a pleasure.